Hello, Scott Posley here with the Imperfection Wellness Podcast. And in our last episode, we explored the concept of awareness. And what I want you to remember with awareness is that it's key to separating ourselves from our thoughts. And if you missed that last episode where we explored awareness, I recommend giving it a listen because awareness is foundational. It helps us separate from our thoughts and allows us to observe them without judgment. But we can't do that if we're not aware that we have these thoughts and we're separate from them. In that episode, we talked about how our thoughts, our beliefs, our emotions, that it's natural parts of being human. They're aspects of who we are, but they're not the core of who we truly are. Instead, there's this version of ourselves that I call our true self, capital T, capital S, true self. And that exists beyond these mental and physical forms. And we start with awareness because it allows us to observe these aspects of ourselves without getting caught up in association with them, without letting them define us for who we are. We also talked a little bit about ego in that episode. And I like how Eckhart Tolle describes ego as the unobserved mind, that voice within. And it's the part of us that believes we are our thoughts. We are our looks, our beliefs. And our ego clings to these things as if they define us, defining us as who we are. And I'm here to question that and say, no, I call that an attachment to our mental and physical form. And this attachment drives our dissatisfaction. It drives our restlessness in our daily lives. And when we're fully identified with this ego, we fall into a trap. And that trap is thinking that if we could just control or perfect these external aspects, whether it's our body, our possessions, our career, our opinions, our beliefs, our ideas, once we perfect those, then we'll find happiness. But the reality is, these things are fleeting. I call them fleeting externals. Because the more we attach to them, the more we suffer because they're always changing. Our beliefs change over time. Our beauty changes over time. Our job title will change over time. And what happens when we no longer have those things if we're identified as one with them, if they define our self-worth? We feel lost. And this brings us to today's topic, egoic attachment. And egoic attachment to me is that tendency to tie our sense of self-worth to these external factors, these fleeting externals, these transient changing things, whether they be our job title, our appearance, our political beliefs. And today we'll explore how attachment keeps us stuck in cycles of this wanting, of this dissatisfaction. And it's so subconscious, we don't even realize it. And more importantly, talking through how we can break free of this. Something as simple as being aware can help us break free. Additionally, knowing that we can transcend or go beyond our thoughts and our beliefs and our attachments through a simple technique that I call meditation, why I became a meditation teacher. But even if you don't want to learn how to meditate, I'll still give you some tips and tricks on how you can learn to release the attachment, to come back to present moment. And before we begin, go ahead and grab your copy of Posley's Paradigm. If you don't have it, visit imperfectionwellness.com, click on Posley's Paradigm, download your free copy, because we're talking about each concept every week. And while we're talking about these concepts in order, I always want to underscore you don't need to follow them in any order. I just need to start somewhere as I explain them. But when you look at the paradigm, start wherever you want to start. I think awareness is key, but it doesn't matter. Maybe you want to be the observer. Maybe you want to surrender. Maybe you want to go to affirmations and gratitude. That's great. But going back to today's episode, I want to talk about egoic attachment because it's a concept that affects all of us. And again, sometimes in ways we don't even realize. And I'm going to open with a personal story that will shed a little bit of light on attachment. And there was a time when my entire identity was wrapped up in my job title. I had worked hard to climb the corporate ladder. I wasn't an A plus student. I didn't have a 4.0. I didn't graduate at the top of my class. I was always kind of self-conscious about that. And so I worked very hard for the title, the status. And every time I got a promotion, I had this surge of pride, this feeling of this validation. And inadvertently, I didn't realize it because I wasn't aware, but I equated my self-worth with my position, with my job title, with my salary. And I believed that the more prestigious my title, the more valuable I was as a person. And then one day, I was passed over for a promotion that I was perfect for. I'd been eyeing it for months. This was mine for the taking. And when I didn't get it, my ego took a massive hit, but I didn't know it was my ego at the time. I felt like a failure. I felt inadequate. And for weeks, I ruminated on what I could have done differently and how this loss of this job title reflected poorly on me, like it really affected me. And when I look back in hindsight, and when I really started practicing these concepts and putting them into play and looking at awareness, I realized I attached my self-worth to my job title. There's nothing wrong with working hard. There's nothing wrong with getting the promotion. But we become aware that our self-worth is separate from that. And I started to recognize the patterns that I measured my value based on so many fleeting externals, things that come and go, like a job title, our looks, an idea, an opinion, or a belief. I based my worth on opinions and recognitions from others. That's no way to live, because you're always at the mercy of the roller coaster ride of what's outside of you. And when we bring our awareness to this attachment, we're able to take a step back. And I was able to question why my job title had so much power over how I saw myself. And this shift in awareness didn't mean I stopped caring about my career. It just meant that I stopped letting it define me. And I realized my worth was inherent to me. It wasn't tied to the label I had at work. This awareness allowed me to enjoy my job more freely, without the constant pressure of needing to prove myself through external validation. Attachment, and specifically egoic attachment, I explain it as our tendency to cling to things, to people, to ideas or beliefs. And that clinging gives us our worth. It's also that ego voice inside our head that says, I'll be happy when, or I'll feel fulfilled if I just have this or I achieve that. And I'm sure this sounds familiar to you. And that's our ego at work. And ego attachment happens when we tie our sense of self-worth, our value as a person, our happiness to these external things. Whether it's these possessions, these beauty standards, these career achievements. And while it's fine and natural to care about these things, again, that problem arises when we start believing that they define us. And why does this happen? Well, because it's our ego. And our ego thrives on attachment because it's constantly seeking validation, control, and security. And that ego is a fear-based mechanism. It's always wanting more because the more it has, the better it feels. And with the unobserved mind, the ego takes over. But when we start observing these thoughts, when we bring awareness to it, and now we're the observed mind, we're the observer, suddenly we realize our self-worth comes from within. And all these things we're attaching to are temporary. Whether it's possessions, our looks, our beliefs, they're ever changing. And when the things we've attached ourselves to start to shift or fade, That's this dissatisfaction, this anxiety, this suffering. Another aspect of this comes in with cultural norms. And how do cultural norms play a significant role in shaping our attachment to external things? And the answer is, if you look at today's world, we're constantly bombarded in a 24/7 news cycle. We have unrealistic beauty standards, we have social media, aggressive politics, and if we're not aware, attachment is unavoidable. These cultural forces not only shape our perceptions, but also reinforce our need to find validation outside of ourselves. And this contributes to a cycle of attachment that keeps us tethered to the opinions of others, to societal expectations, and to these fleeting standards of success. And something I became very aware of last year was when I stopped watching the news. I'll read a headline here or there, but the 24/7 news cycle is very fear-based, and our ego clings to that. We live in an age where information is constantly accessible, and it's often overwhelming. We're not prepared for this. There's news channels, there's websites, there's social media feeds, and this churns out so much information constantly. And it's so hard to unplug because you turn the TV on and it's there. Even our commercials. So even if you're watching a fun TV show and you have a commercial, boom, there it is. And when you have this environment, it becomes so easy to attach ourselves to narratives or ideologies that resonate with us. And when we're attached, it's hard for us to see another perspective because we're not aware. It's that unobserved mind. And it's looking at the news isn't about reporting facts anymore. It's about getting you to engage, getting you to continue watching. And a lot of times it's through sensationalism. And when we take this all in, we realize our emotional reactions and attachment are fueled by this. And if you want to think about this from an example, think of a news story. Think of the emotional charge that comes from watching something that aligns with your political beliefs. It feels validating. Oh, I'm on the right side of this. Great. But what happens when those beliefs are challenged? Or what happens when the story is contradicted? Suddenly we feel defensive, angry, threatened. And this reaction isn't just a response to the facts, it's a sign of the attachment we have. And we inadvertently begin to identify so deeply with these narratives that they become a part of who we are when left unchallenged. And if there is a challenge, it feels like a personal attack because of this attachment. And again, this goes back to we suffer, we feel division. Instead of coming together, we're separated. And in a polarized political climate, this attachment becomes even more pronounced. It's an us versus them mentality. And it's perpetuated by media outlets, keeping us hooked. And if we're unaware, we just keep buying into it. And that's why awareness is so important. Because what happens is we're not just consuming information, we're reinforcing our identity through it. And this attachment keeps us locked in a cycle of judgment and comparison. And we lose moderation. We lose coming to the table, having discussions. And that divides us, which then further strengthens our attachment. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about something that affects all of us. I turned 50 this year, and it was a challenge for me, I gotta be honest, because when you look at beauty standards in our society, beauty standards in the gay world, which I'm a part of, it definitely is a mindset shift when you're no longer the quote-unquote target audience. You feel like you're aging out. And if we go back to this and think of applying it to beauty standards, they've long been a source of attachment. because the standards are more unrealistic than ever before because we don't even know what's real anymore. With filters and airbrushing and AI, with magazines and social media influencers, we're constantly presented with images of what society deems quote unquote beautiful. These images create a subconscious standard, and many of us chase it without even realizing it. And the beauty industry thrives on this attachment. We're told if we buy just the right products, if we undergo the right procedures, if we achieve that certain look, we'll finally feel good about ourselves. The problem is that these standards are not only unrealistic, but they're ever changing. And as a result, we end up on this perpetual hamster wheel of dissatisfaction, always chasing the next ideal, but never quite reaching it. I'm not demonizing social media. There's a lot of good social media out there. I've really kind of honed in on positive social media. But if you're not careful, it can magnify these issues. Because now, instead of comparing ourselves to an ad or to a celebrity, we're comparing ourselves to everybody because social media is ever present. And it also kicks on to that dopamine, that pleasure center. So now we're getting stuck on our social media. And we'll talk about that more in a later episode. But when we look at these curated images that we see online, it makes it seem like everyone has it together. These perfect bodies, these perfect lives, these perfect happinesses. And what's happening is we're comparing our lows to their highs and feeling worse. This further creates a sense of inadequacy and creates additional attachment to this external validation. And so, if we're not careful, for many people, this can lead to anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, the inability to be content with who we are as we are. And we become so attached to these markers that we lose sight of our intrinsic worth. I alluded earlier to social media and dopamine, but if we look at kind of what I call the dopamine trap, social media is meant to keep us scrolling and engaging and liking. And when we get a like or a follower or a comment, we get a little dopamine kick, that chemical responsible for pleasure and reward. And over time, if we're not careful, we can get addicted to this cycle. And what happens if we don't get a like or a follow or a comment? We're not validated. And this can affect us negatively. And if we're not careful, it creates an attachment to the opinions of others. We begin to equate our self-worth with how many followers we have, how many likes we get, how many people comment. And so social media is creating a constant comparison game. And when we measure our lives against the highlight reels of others, we're many times going to fall short. Doesn't mean we don't engage in social media. It just means we become aware of this. And now that I'm aware of it, I do use social media. I engage with social media. But since I have my awareness there, it's a more positive experience. And I also set limits around how much I use it. And believe me, I use all the concepts in the paradigm when it comes to social media, likes, followers, comments. Because I'm in this too. I'm building my foundation. This is new for me. And so I get it. And again, I talked a bit about this common thread of attachment creating dissatisfaction, fear, anger. And we might be saying, why? Well, because what we're attaching to, whether it's possessions or beliefs or beauty or ideas or job titles, it's temporary and constantly shifting. And the ego doesn't like that. The ego wants certainty, control, validation. But the reality is, the more we chase these external things to feel whole, the further away from contentment we become. And let's go back to beauty for a moment. The ego will say, if you look a certain way, you'll feel good about yourself. But the truth is, no matter how much we change, the standards shift, or we age, or we change. And if we've attached our self-worth to something as fleeting as physical appearance, what happens when those changes occur? We suffer. We have an identity crisis. The same thing applies to material possessions. You might feel so accomplished when you buy that new car, that bigger house, that latest phone. But that satisfaction fades. What happens when you see the newer phone or the nicer car or the bigger house? You start comparing to others, whether it's comparing to an ad, comparing to someone on social media, comparing to a friend. That's ego at play. If you're ever judging or rating or comparing, know that you're in ego mode. Because true self has this contentment and fulfillment from within, and that's what the paradigm, all 9 concepts put together, try to get to this internal place as true self in present moment with fulfillment and contentment from within. The more we're attached to external things, the more we set ourselves up for disappointment when they change or disappear. And I'm hoping at this point you have an understanding of some of these concepts. And please feel free to comment or reach out if you want clarity in a future podcast. I'd love this to be, interactive. But now I want to kind of shift to, okay, now that we have this awareness, what can we do? And breaking free from these attachments, breaking free from the ego, requires one thing: awareness. It all begins with awareness, and that's why awareness is the first concept in Posley's paradigm. Once you become aware that you're attaching your self-worth to something outside of you, you have the power to step back and say, wait, stop. My worth isn't tied to this. I'm more than my possessions, my looks, or my beliefs. It's okay that I have these things. It's okay that I enjoy my possessions, but they don't define me intrinsically. And awareness gives us that space. We begin to see the things we've attached to just as they are, which is things that change over time. Going back to that new car you might have gotten, it's okay to feel great driving it. There's a sense of accomplishment. That's great. But as the months go by and that newer model comes out, or a friend buys one that's more expensive, suddenly that car doesn't feel as special. And if that's the case, then you know you've tied your worth to it, because your car is just as good. It gets you from point A to B. With awareness, we realize the car doesn't add or take away from any of our self-worth, any of our intrinsic value. We still enjoy driving it, but its importance diminishes. The same with beauty. As we cultivate awareness, we notice that our sense of self isn't rooted in how you look on the outside. You appreciate your physical form exactly as it is without letting it dictate your self-worth. And in breaking free from this attachment, we bring our awareness to how these cultural norms shape our thoughts and our beliefs and our behaviors. It doesn't mean we don't enjoy the news. It doesn't mean we don't post on social media. It doesn't mean we don't buy skincare products or talk politics. Instead, we become aware of our egoic attachment. And through awareness, we remove our self-worth from the equation. And once we're fully aware, we can question our attachments. Do I need to watch the news daily? Do I need to compare myself to someone else on social media? Do I need a like or a follower? And the answer, of course, is no. Because again, our worth comes from within, not from external validation. And yes, it's nice to get a pat on the back. And yes, it's nice to get a comment or a follower. But it's not needed for that intrinsic worth. And again, it goes back to awareness of this. And then we start letting go. We break free from this cycle of wanting. Break free from this cycle of comparison. Break free from this cycle of dissatisfaction. As we close out today's episode, you may be asking yourself, great, you've talked about awareness, but I'm still stuck in attachment. What else can I do? And when we utilize the concepts of the paradigm, whichever one we're focusing on, but for this week we're talking about attachment, we're starting to break free from that ego, coming back to our true self in present moment. And I talk about present moment because when we're attached to the ego, a lot of times we're storytelling. We're telling ourselves a story that's maybe half-truths and our interpretations. And when we're storytelling, we're also time traveling to the past or future, and we're not our true self in present moment. And that's why we're talking about what we're talking about. And so I thank you for listening to today's episode. I think it was kind of a heavy episode, at least it was for me, because when I first became aware of attachments, there were definitely some mixed feelings. And again, please reach out, email me, look at the show notes for all the information and all the links, but definitely comment and, give feedback on if there's something you'd like to clarify more in a future episode. But in next week's episode, we'll be switching gears and diving into the third concept in Posley's paradigm, which is acceptance. And I talk about acceptance of it's not just accepting what is, it's accepting what was and what will be. And this can also be a tough concept, but when we study acceptance and we learn about acceptance, it's about finding peace in the present moment, even when things don't go as planned, which happens more often than not. And we'll explore how to sit with this discomfort, release this resistance to change, and embrace the idea that everything in life, both the ups, both the downs, they're part of our growth. And acceptance isn't about giving up. It's about letting go of the need to control everything and trusting that in the grand scheme, things are unfolding just as they should. This is a powerful step to our inner freedom, to our inner awareness. And I can't wait to share it with you. So as always, thanks for listening and wishing you the best on your wellness journey.